morning, everybody. I'm Bruce Schwegler. The big story today continues to be this storm churning off the southeast Atlantic coastline, spinning ocean waters and rising tides along the entire southeast coastline. We are seeing some of the coastal barrier islands being evacuated at this time, and portions of Charleston and also Miami, Florida are being evacuated. This big storm will continue to lift northward. It's the 10th we've had so far this season. Fair weather prevails here in the northeast, but it's warm to hot and dry as you head to the west coast. The coolest spot way out here along the coastline in the Pacific Northwest. Temperatures in the 80s and 90s at those coastal locales on through Washington and Oregon. Otherwise, much of the country in the 110s from the Great Plains southwestward all the way on through Arizona and interior California. Even really hot and dry along the mid-Atlantic coastline and hot and steamy in portions of Florida. Temperatures in the 90s. We are continuing to have this heat, the drought conditions. 12 states in the nation's midsection have been declared disaster areas. And right now it looks like this heat is going to continue right on through much of the month of October. I'll be back later with the complete 30-day outlook for that month of October after these messages.
We're definitely in the crisis. There's already data that we've seen that over the last 100 years we've already raised the Earth's average temperature by 1 degree. That may not seem like a lot, but if you look at the difference between our temperature now and the temperature at the last ice age, the difference is only 5 degrees. So we're talking about, relative to that, a big difference. And of course, in the last ice age, this part of the country in Chicago was covered with glaciers. So it really, we're talking about major impacts. And even if we stopped now using fossil fuels, if we stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere, we still might well be committed to another degree or 2 degrees of global warming. So that we're already at the point where by using fossil fuels, coal and oil and gas the way we have, we've already done things that have inextricably changed the nature of this planet.
What happens if we don't change anything? If things just stay status quo, conservative, just the way they are, what happens?
One thing that may happen is that the ice around the polar caps and in the glaciers may melt. We'll get sea level rise. Some of the coastal cities will be inundated. In other places, the water from the oceans will get into the groundwater along the coast and it'll destroy cropland, destroy animal habitats. Here, what the scenarios predict at this point are very hot summers with drought that'll destroy much of the agricultural capability of this area. A lot of what this may mean are things like much higher rates of malnutrition and starvation, particularly in underdeveloped countries as the food availability is decreased because agriculture is failing. That's a scenario that may come about in 50 to 100 years. And hopefully before we reach that point, we'll have woken up to the point where we see we need to change something. But even at that, our air quality may very well go down. And in fact, if you look at the data, air quality hasn't improved all that much in the last 10 years. And it may decrease even further if we don't do something now. We will see increases in temperature. This decade's already been the hottest decade on record. And the next decades will probably be hotter, particularly if we don't do something. And that'll mean more people who will have heat stroke, other kinds of illness. And even if we don't see the kinds of drought that I talked about earlier, we may have more summers where farmers in the Midwest and in other agricultural regions will just have a harder time, where crops are more likely to fail. Food prices may rise a little bit. Those are the kind of things that I think are very realistic projections over the next 10 years, over the next 20 years. And the sooner that we wake up, and as Ann Landers would say, smell of coffee, the sooner we're going to avoid some of the worst case scenarios.
I think what people need to understand now is something very important that the entire scientific community is starting to get behind. And that is, when it comes to the environment, we have at best 10 years left in order to make the positive impacts we need to make to turn things around. After 10 years, we're not going to be doing scientific studies of the environment. We're going to be doing scientific autopsies. And only you, the consumer, the average person on the street, is going to be able to make the difference that's going to make it a success or a failure over the next 10 years. If you don't get involved now, not only will you not have the opportunity, but you are selling your kids out. They will not have the choices we have now to make the correct choices on energy in the future. I think one of the things that's important now in terms of timing is that this is coming right after the 20th anniversary of Earth Day, which motivated a lot of people who normally wouldn't have come out for environmental things to get involved in this. So from that standpoint, the timing is real good. I think the other message here, though, is that, look, the bureaucracies, the government agencies, all these jokers have had their chance to do something about energy, and they have consistently neglected their job. The individual can do something, and I think that's what this project is demonstrating, is that we use energy, we have choices we can make and influence what happens.
We're beginning to see a lot more outcry about things like the role of the political action committees, particularly the big corporate PACs, who can sway elections real easily. I mean, John Dingell may be a very nice man, but he knows that the auto manufacturers can put a lot of money into a race against him, and he's afraid that that may make the difference in the long run. And we may need to see a new form of politics. We may need to see some changes, but I think the most important change isn't one that's so much structural as one where the people begin to pay attention a little bit more. We can't just sit back and let other people do the voting for us, let other people talk to the senators for us. We have to do it ourselves. We have to get out there and make sure that they're paying attention. One of the things you find when you talk to senators or representatives or state legislators is that they're regular folks. Some of them are real bright, some of them aren't so bright. And what they're worried about is getting elected. They want to keep their jobs. And if we talk to them, if we make sure that we express our opinions on election day as well as before election day, then I think we may see some changes in the political structure of this country that'll have a real impact, both for us and for future generations. I think this November, given what's gone on in the Capitol the last few weeks with the budget crisis, we may see some changes, and I hope we do. But we may see some changes, and maybe ultimately these folks will get a message that people are paying attention, that they can't just have Ford and Chrysler and GM be calling the shots, that they represent the American people, and that's who they have to respond to. Another thing that we've been working for is the Bryan bill in Congress. In the last Congress, it's been Senate Bill 1224, and it'll be reintroduced again after the first of the year. That bill would force auto manufacturers to raise the average gas mileage of their fleet of cars. Today, the average mileage is supposed to be 27 miles per gallon. This would bring it up to about 35 by the mid-90s and up to about 40 by the year 2000. Even 40 miles per gallon is very doable. There are cars out on the street today that get 40 miles per gallon. So we're not talking about a science fiction story here. There are prototypes that get 60 or 70 miles per gallon. But the auto manufacturers and the oil companies are resisting this because they want to sell more cars and they want to sell more gas.
What does the oil thing going on in the Middle East now, isn't it a direct reflection on keeping the prices low, no new research, no new replacements, no solar funding? Is that what's going on?
Harper's just last week, I think it was, came out and had their usual statistic in there of we are spending $34 million a day in the Persian Gulf, and we're putting at risk 100, 250,000 lives to fight for a lifestyle that just wastes energy like crazy. Yet, in the closing years of the Reagan administration, our Congress and our president said we couldn't afford $100 or $200 million per year to develop energy resources like conservation or efficiency. So, I mean, that just shows, what the real game is all about here. It's not energy independence or anything like that. It's big power, and not in the electron sense. We're talking power that's been entrenched and that is really going for its own political self-interest.
If we start right now and become more energy efficient, and there are things that we can do immediately and things that we can put some resources into now, if we begin to put more research and development into renewables such as solar and wind energy and so on, then what we'll see happen is it will decrease both the amount of CO2 that we put into the air and the amount of other pollutants. Slowly, I think our air quality will increase rather than decrease and we'll be able to be in a situation where we'll be able to use our resources more wisely. I think what we want to find is a situation where we recognize that the resources that we have here on this planet are limited, and that what we have to do is recycle when we can, reduce our use, particularly of things like energy, which aren't often renewable, reuse materials when we can, all of which are things that often we can do without a great hardship to most of us.
One of the most serious threats I think that we have that could really retard efforts to deal with global warming is if nuclear power is given an enhanced role. The nuclear industry is looking at the global warming issue as an opportunity for resurgence. They claim that since reactors don't produce carbon dioxide, it's a logical concept that it would displace coal or oil. But the reality is that nuclear power is going to be far too expensive, take far too long to put into effect, and even when it's in effect, we'll have such a small percentage of difference in the total global warming of the world that what it'll really do is suck the resources out of the areas that we really need to focus on, which is energy efficiency, conservation, improvements in transportation, areas like that, which are much more in the control of the individual consumer. So nuclear, an enhanced nuclear scenario, is a real danger to the country.
I heard two facts. Let me check them. One is that Illinois has the most nuclear power plants. Number two is we have the highest rates. Is that true?
Correct on both accounts. We have 14 reactors in Illinois, and the Chicago area, Commonwealth Edison Service Territory, if it doesn't have the highest rates in the country, it certainly has within the top 2 or 3, and it's the result of the overconstruction of nuclear reactors.
And how many of our reactors are situated within walking distance to the lake?
Only the 2 Zion reactors north of Chicago, about 35 miles, are on Lake Michigan. But all the others are on important rivers like the Mississippi River and the Illinois River, which supplies drinking water for many communities. And there are reactors all over the Great Lakes, somewhere on the order of 40-plus reactors on both sides of the border. Canada and the United States are situated on the world's largest freshwater drinking source. I think it's really appalling and very scary, and very few organizations are looking into any of the problems associated with that.
We actually just did a study at UCS on some of these advanced reactors to make an assessment of how safe they really were, since they're being put forward as, the safe nuclear reactors. And we found that there are flaws in the design of each of them, and that in part these flaws relate also to Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensing procedures, which are very lax and which don't provide the safety factor that they were originally set up to.
We have not disposed of a single ounce of high-level nuclear waste since the first commercial nuclear reactor opened over 20 years ago. It's all sitting around in glorified swimming pools on the reactor sites, waiting for that magical day when the federal government will open its permanent geological disposal facility, and they claim that won't be until at least the year 2010. But this is the third revision of their timetable. The low-level waste is currently being dumped in 3 sites around the country: Washington State, Nevada, South Carolina. There were 3 other sites available that have been closed down, and 5 of those 6 that I've just mentioned have been shown to be leaking radionuclides already. In a couple of years, the situation is going to change, though, because all these sites will be closed, and the states are going to have to build new sites to dispose of the radioactive garbage they've already got. We have the ability right now in this state to harness roughly 3.5 nuclear reactors worth of cogeneration power if the political will were there and the economics were there to make that possible. So you can't tell me that we need any more reactors. Current estimates, even by the EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute in California, say that we waste somewhere on the order of 25 to 30% of all the electricity we generate. Nuclear power, all 114 plants we have, only contribute 19% of the nation's electricity. So you tell me what direction we should head in given numbers like that, when the industry itself even admits that we're wasting that much.
I got my electric bill a few days ago, and I looked down the items and I saw Conservancy Research. I looked over to the dollar amount, 2 goose eggs, 0. It's even on there. The taxes are on there, the high rates are on there, the summer rates reflect in there. Conservancy Research, 0. What's wrong here? What's going on?
You're really getting to why nuclear power will not make a positive benefit or contribution on the global warming issue. The fact is that whenever you have the opportunity to build these expensive plants and make money off of the building process, you discourage the opportunity to conserve. Just like any good pusher, a utility that knows that its clients are addicted to energy will want to build bigger and bigger nuclear power plants or coal-fired plants so people will use more energy. I mean, that's just the way addiction is laid out. So it's just really an antipodal situation. If you're going to go nuclear, you're absolutely going to have catastrophic results on efficiency and conservation.
And one of the real sad aspects of this, almost criminal aspects, is that we have out there technology, renewable technologies that could do the job much better than nuclear, but which simply haven't been funded, especially over the last decade. And so they're not in the place yet where they can be put into effect in enough areas to supplant the fossil fuels that we now use. We really need to see a lot more action in terms of budgets for research and development on renewables, as well as a lot more emphasis put on energy efficiency.
Tomorrow we close them all down, right? Where does it get made up?
We have painted ourselves into a nuclear corner, and it's going to take some time, realistically, to get ourselves out of that corner. Some areas of the country would be devastated economically if you did what you just suggested, shutting it down like that. But a methodically planned, well-organized effort that brought in a lot of different approaches to energy, such as demand-side management, which would include efficiency, conservation, those kinds of things. You expand the mix of energy producers to include more alternatives, or cogeneration, which is probably the nation's best-kept energy secret. You plan methodically, you can start phasing out the reactors you have and soften that economic blow. There will be an economic blow, and it'll be very tough in the New England states and very tough in the Midwest. But there's enough electricity on the grid today where, given the wires we've got strung, we could shuffle it around and at least theoretically turn everything off tomorrow. The problem is not so much with technology, it's with individuals and consumerism and lifestyle, and that's where the changes have to be made. These reactors won't make a lick of difference there. They'll only keep the energy addiction going, which continues the spiral that caused global warming in the first place.
There are actually ways that we can reduce the amount of CO2 we put into the air by 1 billion pounds. It's not as awesome as it may at first sound like. By doing things like driving less, or when we go out and buy new cars, buying ones that get better gas mileage, by using the new forms of light bulbs that use less electricity, by getting more energy efficient appliances, and a variety of other methods, we can actually reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and therefore reduce the amount of CO2 we put in the atmosphere. So there are ways of doing it. It's a realistic goal, and if everybody does their own bit, which doesn't mean necessarily everybody has to do 1 billion pounds, but if every American did 4 pounds less of CO2 a year, which would be only maybe changing a couple of light bulbs in your house, something like that, we would actually be able to meet our goal.
People are suddenly awake, and in some instances they're looking for something to do. Energy is really a tough sell because unlike some other environmental issues where you deal with cuddly, furry animals that clubbed over the head and really tug at the heart, talking about BTUs and electron volts and things like that just doesn't really have the same warm glow about it. So on that, from that standpoint, it's hard to involve people. But we are finding now that circumstances are coming up where people are getting involved in energy issues. Locally, things like the Commonwealth Edison rate hikes, the franchise agreements amongst cities and utilities are areas where people are really starting to say, wait a minute, we've got to change the way we do business. We have to get serious about some of the things Christine mentioned, conservation and efficiency. We have to look at energy in a different way. So I think some of the planners are coming around. I think a lot more people are becoming aware that as individuals they can contribute to the solution, they can get involved.
Second thing that we have to do, and we need to do this right away, and this has to be done to a large extent at the federal level, is to put more money into research on renewable sources of energy and also development of those sources of energy. There are in California, for example, some wind farms that are actually putting out several megawatts of power already for California. That's a viable source of power in that area. Could be a viable source of power in many other areas. It's possible, potentially, I think, to set up wind farms in the Illinois and Wisconsin area, for example. Solar energy is something that is a little farther away from actual development in a lot of instances, but there is research being done, and more research could be done to make it a much more viable option. There are a variety of other renewable sources that we need to do more research on, more development on. We can do that now. We can get those into gear now so that we're ready when those nuclear plants start being decommissioned to have those resources available so that we don't have to build other fossil fuel plants.
It's really a myth to believe that many of these resources are farther down in the future. This is stuff that exists today. It's being utilized not only in the crazy California areas, but in Illinois. I mean, the stuff is being used here now in many instances. Passive solar design, improvements in architecture, efficiency and weatherization of homes. Certain aspects of solar are even usable in this area of the country. Small hydro. Cogeneration, which I mentioned earlier. It's merely the recovering of what's currently being frittered away as waste heat from any power plant and reusing that heat to perform a task.
What can we tell the people to show them that they can afford these changes and that if they don't, they're wasting money?
People have to become responsible adults on the energy issues, and they will find that if they would just broaden their horizon a little bit and allow themselves to think in the slightly longer term, they will save money. We can demonstrate this over 2, 5, 7, 8-year periods of time. Unfortunately, consumers are now thinking 2 months to 6 months, and if I don't get my money back, I'm not going to buy it. That's absolutely crazy, and it really is in their economic it's not in their economic interest to keep thinking like that. The free ride is over on energy. In fact, that's the one thing we do have to do, we didn't even get into, is this whole notion that the laws of economics that govern our country now are going in the exact opposite direction of the way the laws of the universe operate. The laws of thermodynamics are very fixed. It tells you you don't get it something for nothing with energy. You always pay a price, and you'll always get less energy out than you put in. I mean, this is the way the universe operates, yet our economy and our advertising and everything we do tells us exactly the opposite. Well, if I could grab that lens, I would say, look, you're 34 years old out there watching this, act like an adult. You know, if your grandmother were here, she'd slap you upside of the head and say, go to bed. You know, you're being a self-centered, selfish little brat. You know, that's what I would do. I'd like to shake people, you know, literally shake them and, you know, smack them around a little bit and say, wake up, you know, you're an adult now, act like one. And remember that, you know, you can't get something for nothing. A little bit of investment now will pay off in the long term. And it'll be better not just for you, but for everybody.
We have an administration, our so-called environmental president, who's been incredibly unresponsive on this, as he has been on many other issues. His chief of staff, John Sununu, who fancies himself a big nuclear scientist, says he doesn't believe any of this stuff, and he is blocking any effort to move in any direction except for fossil and nuclear fuel use. So on that level, we're seeing some real roadblocks. On the other hand, Congress did pass a Clean Air Act, a new version for the first time in many years, and at the state and local level, there are a lot of places where we're seeing a lot of potential for change. 15 years ago, I remember a lot of companies were sending me credit cards. They said, you know, easy credit, and you got 6, 7 credit cards, and you spent up to the limit, and you wound up owing $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, and that happened to a lot of people. And in the last few years, people that did that have been paying the price. You wind up paying your 20% interest rates on what was quote-unquote easy credit. Turned out not to be so easy anymore. And I think that's where we're at with energy. We've had a lot of years of easy credit, easy energy there. We could just spend up to the limit. And what we're entering into is a period where we can't spend up to the limit anymore. We have to take a look at our balance sheets and decide what we want to do. In some ways, for people like myself that are in their 40s, you start thinking about retirement, and you think that maybe you need to do a little bit of saving for your old age. We need to do a little bit of saving now, because by the time we turn 65, we may not have very much money in our bank accounts, and we may not have very much by way of a reasonable atmosphere to breathe. So we have to think in long-term, in a long-term perspective. Not look at it as easy credit, but look at it as spending money that we aren't going to have later on, and that in fact our kids aren't going to have, our grandchildren aren't going to have. We need to do something now to make a difference for them down the road as well as for ourselves. I'd like to suggest to you to think a little bit about the world that we live in. We aren't apart from it, we're a part of it. And we have to make it a world that we can live in as well as our children and those that come after them. We have a choice now to take action to do that, or we have a choice to sit back and pretend that we don't need to do anything. I urge everyone who's watching this to take action now. You can make a difference. You can have an impact. And together we can have even a greater impact. Do it now, or we may not have a chance to do it later.
Global warming is caused by a process called the greenhouse effect. And in a sense, the world is a greenhouse, created by invisible gases in our atmosphere which help capture heat from the sun. Without this heat trap, life could not exist. However, during the last 100 years, we as a society have pumped huge amounts of industrial gases into our atmosphere. These gases are creating an imbalance in our Earth's atmosphere, trapping more and more heat. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is by far the most plentiful of these gases. It comes from burning fossil fuels such as coal and oil. It comes from electric power plants, industrial processes, heating systems, and from America's favorite machine, the automobile. For all our success in creating great industries and in forging the most comfortable way of life in history, the legacy we leave to our children may not be what we had hoped.
Contact the Union of Concerned Scientists at 26 Church Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts 02238, or call them at 617-547-5552, and call the Nuclear Energy Information Service at 708-869-7650.
Fred used to feel like he was an alien. He recycled, saved energy, cared for wildlife and other people, and everyone looked at him like he was from outer space. Then Fred saw the Earth Network TV show and found out that there were many people like him. All the time, he was the Earthling, and the others were aliens who acted like they were from some planet where there was an unlimited supply of natural resources and places to pile garbage. Fred joined the Earth Network. His $15 membership goes towards putting together weekly TV that shows aliens how to act on Earth. Send $15 and a list of shows you think the aliens need to see to the Earth Network, P.O. Box 831, Highland Park, Illinois, 60035. And not only do you get a TV show for your membership, you get this TV shirt.
This big storm will continue to lift northward. It's the 10th we've had so far this season. Fair weather prevails here in the Northeast, but it's warm to hot and dry. As you head to the west coast, the coolest spot way out here along the coastline in the Pacific Northwest. Temperatures in the 80s and 90s at those coastal locales on through Washington and Oregon. Otherwise, much of the country in the 110s from the Great Plains southwestward all the way on through Arizona and interior California. Even really hot and dry along the mid-Atlantic coastline and hot and steamy in portions of Florida. Temperatures in the 90s. We are continuing to have this heat, the drought conditions. 12 states in the nation's midsection have been declared disaster areas. And right now it looks like this heat is going to continue right on through much of the month of October. I'll be back later with the complete 30-day outlook for that month of October after these messages.
There's something about those high-powered sports cars and sedans. People see you smoking them, they know you're somebody. But the doc says I gotta cut down on my smoking. Try one of those compact cars that don't burn so much gas, or share public transportation smoke with other people. I can do it. I'm gonna cut down tomorrow.